Hi everyone, welcome to the Inspire Online Book Club. Fiona Littlewood here, Principal Librarian at Inspire. Today we're joined by Clare, Terri, Matilda, Michelle and Janice, and we're going to be talking about The Moment of Lift by Melinda Gates. The reason we chose this book is that March is Women's History Month, so we thought it would be very topical. The central premise of Melinda's book is that women's lives are greatly empowered. If women's lives are empowered, that has an impact not only on the family, but also on the wider community. And to demonstrate this, she uses lots of examples from her work with the Gates Foundation, she's done around the world over recent years. I suppose for me, it took me back to the 80s when I was really quite involved in women's groups. So I don't think there were any ideas there that I hadn't come across before, but I did like all the stories that she talked about because it really did bring it to life for me. Can we start with Terri? Would you like to start us off and tell us what you thought about it?
I thoroughly enjoyed the book. I think it's a great lesson in humility and encouraging us to be more empathic towards, our fellow man. I think it's a brutally honest snapshot, really, of life in developing countries. But for me, as I was reading it and, feeling full of admiration for the Gates Foundation, because it's not just Melinda, of course, that there are numerous teams out there. It made me realise that even though the book is focused on developing countries, so much of this is happening in the UK. Mm-hmm. And as an ex-head teacher, and currently I'm a psychotherapist, so I have experience of people who suffer, young children being prepared for what will happen in their culture. We live in a multicultural society, which is marvellous. It's healthy, it's informative, and I think we all have many, many lessons to learn. Yeah. In the respect of inequity and bias and so on and so forth. Mm. So very commendable foundation, and it evokes so many emotions.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. It was quite a hard read at some points, wasn't it? There were some very difficult subjects. I think you probably all know specifically what I'm talking about. Yes. I mean, I must admit, although I knew of the Gates Foundation and I'd heard of Melinda, she's not someone that I would have ever picked out in a lineup. I had no idea what she looked like and no real idea about her role in it. And as well as all the stories of the things that have happened through the Gates Foundation and the little anecdotes, there was also quite a lot that was devoted to her own life and how she achieved her position. And one thing that I particularly liked early on in the book was that she said that Bill never made the mistake of thinking that there wasn't a healthy dollop of luck that had helped him to get where he was. And that for some people, luck just doesn't exist. There's just no way they're ever going to lift themselves out of their circumstances without some outside input. What about you, Janice? What did you think?
Well, I listened to the book.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, I'm building on what Terri was just saying. I found it fascinating because it wasn't just to me, it wasn't just about the foundation and the growth of how they developed, but also how she developed as a human being as well. I have to say, I didn't, when the book was suggested, I had to go on Wikipedia and find out who she was. I mean, I really was ignorant as to, her, apart from it didn't connect to me that it was the same, that foundation. So that perhaps says a little bit more about me. But it was about her growth and also with as a human being, not just as a woman, but also her, as her development as a parent and then and also the clash with her faith, and that's obviously something that others will probably want to pick up. But it really, I found it fascinating, and also it'd be very easy to think about this as being one rich woman's little trip across helping the poor, and all the other stereotypes. But I think at times it was such a very honest about her and her own feelings and how she had to overcome, but it required a lot of thinking. And actually, because of that, it certainly has made me question some of my prejudices. And you think when you're a part of education that you've got quite a broad a breadth of understanding, and you actually, there are some stereotypes and some biases which you don't mean to have, and sometimes you don't even know you have. And I think it was a good wake-up call in my own psyche to perhaps just reevaluate and reconsider some aspects that she was developing.
Yeah, I think you'll probably all have noticed it. We refer to FGM, and she referred to it as cutting. And I picked up on that very early in the book. But as it developed, I gained an understanding of why they describe it as that, because the word mutilation is so laden with value judgments. And if you want people to change, then you don't want to alienate them from the off. No, Matilda, have you got any thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, not going into that right yet, because I think that's a different discussion. I'm not really the same. I'd heard of her quite a lot. I mean, the Bill Gates documentary goes into quite a lot about her. And then I'd also watched a thing with David Letterman quite a while back. And he interviewed her about the book. So I knew a little bit. I'd never read it, but I knew about her. I think it was quite important. I think for me anyway, was listening to it, because she was telling the story. I don't know if that was the same for everyone else.
Yeah,
when
I
they were
listened
listening
to it too.
Yeah, but she was reading it out. So for me, it was kind of linking who I know she is, and like her links to these really famous people, and then also the reality that she's just normal and just doing things that if we all had that money, it's the kind of thing that I would like to think more women would do in her position.
There was another theme that ran through it a bit about the role of rich people in providing these sort of services to developing countries and people who are far less privileged, and how to achieve that balance of not imposing what you think people need and empowering them to say what they need and how that's best achieved.
I think it was that important thing of knowing that it wasn't just her. She wasn't it wasn't like some big well done on all your achievements thing. She first of all did not mention her relation to Bill Gates. Yes, they met, they did a bit of Microsoft, they did a little bit, but she wasn't focusing it on her or her connections. She was very much focused on these underprivileged women and their amazing stories, and she wasn't comparing it. She was just saying different women have different challenges, and she was trying to provide her challenges in comparison to the difficult topics.
There was a bit of me that kind of wanted to think, oh, it's all right for you. But, I do think that she was very humble, and she did make a lot of effort throughout the book to draw attention to the fact that she recognised her own privilege. I don't know, what, got any thoughts on that aspect, Clare?
Yeah, I know I had a certain prejudice against wealthy billionaire trustees, which I think we're worse in this country about it. I think in America it's very widely accepted that that's what rich people go and do, but there's a kind of cynicism about there you go, flashing your cash around. And I think she was painfully aware of that. And so she was really making sure that she was saying, yeah, I'm really lucky. I've got a fantastic life and I've got all these resources, but this isn't about me. As Matilda was saying, let's just look out here. And she is trying, you do get the feeling she is really trying to make a very genuine difference, and not in a kind of grand photograph me way. And I thought that showed itself in the way that lots of these schemes and projects that she mentioned are really at a very micro level, and really in something as simple as getting a young married couple in a society where women are pretty secondary, and so although they bear the babies, do the work, they don't really have agency. But rather than just shouting and preaching about it, she said, okay, well, let's just do a little role play. Again, she wasn't doing this, she was getting professionals. Again, she mentions people all the time that she respects and that have inspired her, and I think that's another part of humility, learning from people. So these experts and educators will go and say to a couple, okay, well, just roll with us for a day, you act like her, you act like him, and then suddenly the men would realize that actually being shouted at all day and having to drag water 12 miles while having a child on your head and one wrapped around you is actually not really conducive to you being happy. And so we think, well, of course it isn't, but obviously within the societies that she was operating, there are just traditions that have happened. You know, the same thing used to happen in this country, and so it's just in a very realistic and very micro way saying, just try and live in someone else's shoes for a day, see how you see what you think about it. And so from that mutual understanding, those young couples were starting to actually have respect for each other, and to realize that they were partners, and that as partners they could be in business together, or they could work together on bringing up their children. And just that one tiny little exercise then had all these much wider benefits, and which did keep expanding her theory of, if you empowering women, giving them access to childcare, to healthcare, particularly birth control, to education, would mean that you could change a society. And she was doing it in a really muscular, obvious, simple way, and I really admired that about her in the book.
Yeah, the 12 miles to the well and back again, I just didn't even know how that was even possible. You know,
I'm trying to do 5K a day and it kills me. Yeah,
and water's heavy. I just don't know how anyone could do that. But yeah, and I felt good on the men who were mentioned for being willing to, like the husband who decided that he would go to the well and collect the water because it would make his wife and his child healthier and happier. And that can't be easy, standing up to the other men in your society who are laughing at you. But I thought that was really good that they did that. What about you, Michelle? Can we bring you in? Are there any particular bits that you wanted to comment on?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with a lot of what has been said. I knew a bit about Melinda, and I do admit I did approach the book a little bit like Clare, that billionaires going off and helping people. But I think it is very clear the way she writes this, that she is so passionate about this message and how she approaches it. Then, you know, she's very humble about it, but she defers to the women themselves, in, you know, these people that are on the very, very margins of society, the untouchables, etc., and also the people that's working with them. And I think by doing that, it is very humbling, and you really get a sense of it. And she does really get across about how, if you do give these women the moment of lift, empower them, you know, what can be achieved. I mean, what struck me is some of these girls in really awful circumstances that wouldn't know any different of how they live. They demanded change. Like the little girl that was, you know, they made money by going through trash, basically. And one of the Gates Foundation workers was there, and she just kept turning up day after day and saying, I want a teacher. I want a teacher. I mean, how did she know to do that? And she ended up, I think it was her, wasn't it, the Maasai girl that ended up maybe getting the stories a little mixed up, working for the UN. And it's just amazing. And I think that's what Melinda's trying to get out of this, is if you do get down to that micro level and really work with the people at the margins of society from their perspective, it can make a huge difference. I find it a very humbling book.
Yeah, and without some kind of it. Sorry, Terri, you come in there. Terri.
No, sorry, I was just saying yes, I agree with Michelle. I think what stands out from the book is the way that she, perhaps not intentionally, she brings the characters to our stage. You know, I'm not reading about accounts of people who are so many miles away, but they're here in front of me. And the other aspect of her work is that she understands, as do the many teams with which she works, that they have to be part of the cultures first before they can help them to change. Whereas, you know, some charities would think, all right, we're going to put X amount of pounds into this effort. But it's about living the lives, walking the path of these people.
And it's good that someone is prepared to do that, because as I said at the beginning, you know, there are people in such circumstances that unless there's outside intervention, they're just trying to get from day to day and stay alive and try and keep their children alive as best they can, even to the point of trying to give their children away because they feel that that's going to be the best thing for them. So there has got to be that outside intervention to even give individuals and communities the opportunity to rise out of their situation even a bit, but they did seem very focused on finding out what it was that the community wanted and how best to deliver that. So I wasn't impressed with that.
Fiona, I think it was kind of important about the margins. It wasn't all to do with the top 1%, the richest people. It was also the margins, the depravity at the bottom. It was quite important because they were appealing to the people in the middle who didn't know what it was like to be right at the bottom, and they didn't know what it was like to be in the richest. And it was very important that she did that, because she wasn't saying you or your neighbour, she was saying it's even below that. Even people here who are on, you know, scraping by, they still don't know. They still have no clue what the other people are dealing with, you know.
It's hard to visualise, really, isn't it?
I think I was going to build on what you were saying, Fiona, about you know, the changes that were made, but it was quite a couple of examples where they came in thinking they were going to do one thing, to do with technology, but they were, because of listening to and really finding out the teams, they actually changed originally what they were doing. So the illustration that I'm thinking of is the one that they were talking about, the rice seed, or the grain, the seeds, and they recognised that these things had been bred or developed, whatever you do with seeds, and they thought they were all right because that's what the men thought, but the women didn't want to pick them because they were so short. It was more backbreaking, so they went back to the old seeds, which obviously weren't as fertile and everything. So that kept that cycle of poverty and hunger going longer. But it was only by talking to the women who were the main farmers that actually made a difference. So they were more prepared to use those seeds, develop those seeds, grow them, and therefore develop that whole community. And that it wasn't just about this is better for women. I think that was a lovely example of how it betters everybody, and trying to remove that whole group from abject poverty, like you've just described, which thankfully I'm very grateful. I've never, however low I've been, I've never had to experience that. But there are a couple of examples of that where they, listening to others, changed and developed respect for, I think, that ability to change their initial ideas and modify their ideas, and even though they weren't based on technology, actually respond to what the community needed. Because I think there are examples of charities going, oh, if that's not what you want, we'll take our money elsewhere, but actually that's what we need. Well, that's not what's within our bounds, you know, so they change to take the money elsewhere, and that's not that, but they seem to be prepared to listen and respond accordingly.
One thing seemed to build on the next, didn't it? I'm casting my mind back to the beginning. Did it start very much looking at birth control and family planning, and how,
Yes.
and that was what they really wanted to do. But it soon became clear that that on its own wasn't enough, and they needed to look at education and women's work. And then towards the end of the book, it kind of ended up in sex work. And again, there were comments about that's not really what we were here to do, but how could they not? So yeah, it was really very broad ranging, wasn't it? The issues that were tackled.
Yeah, and I think
very non-judgmental as well. Sorry. I just think she cast a very dispassionate eye across everybody, and didn't make moral judgments about anybody really. And I just wanted to slightly touch on the elements of biography that she does bring in. She avoids making too many points about herself, but she does give a kind of whistle-stop tour of this is how I met Bill Gates, this is when I started deciding not to work, although you could hardly call her a stay-at-home mom. But she wasn't going to do paid work because she wants to start doing other work, and clearly she's a very busy person. But I quite liked, I was brought up a Catholic, and so I understood very well what she was saying about the approbation she'd received from priests and other religious, saying you fancy giving out birth control to women, that shouldn't be a priority. And first of all, obviously that is a fairly ignorant state of mind, because women do need birth control, societies do need to control their birth rates. But also she just said to them, well, what you really don't like is abortion. You're very anti-abortion. What better way is there of making sure that doesn't happen than by giving women more control over their own fertility? So let's be practical. And that was the point. So it's always, let's be practical. You may not believe in this, but actually the means to that end is this. So let's just try and apply these things practically and helpfully, and not be too theoretical. And I think that ties in with what Janice was saying. So you don't have a theory and impose it upon people. You look on that level where people are actually living, and say, this is what they need now, and this is what we can give them. And sometimes it's not more money, sometimes it's just a more sensible way of spending that money. And that was a really practical point about her that I admired.
And I was just going to go back to the fact that she wasn't just comparing it as in people far away, but actually basing some of the debate on the US and perhaps the past administration. And some of the, was it Comstock? I'd never heard of. Again, that was another Wikipedia search. But just that hypocrisy, but I thought that was very useful to show that it wasn't until 1965 about the change in the thinking in the US, and that was still for married women. And I think that's good, because that's not good, but I think it's very useful to be reminded of how that debate in the Western world has been going on for such a long time, and the reasons, the reasons that sit behind that, rather than putting some societies on a moral high ground as though we're perfect. Actually, there's lots of imperfections, and there are still cracks there that it's very easy for other people's will to actually override lots of women, and therefore create poverty or create difficulties for not just the women's lives, but the children's lives and the next generation's lives, and so on and so forth. I thought that was very powerfully written, but a good balance, so that people could really, that's what I'm saying about looking within yourself rather than just looking at people in perhaps far off lands.
Yeah, I enjoyed that contrast between, her progression, some of the barriers that she'd found, and other women in the States, particularly, women of colour, and it's the same kind of theme, but the different experiences. But I thought, as you say, it was good to draw attention to the fact that is going on in some guys everywhere in the world. It just demonstrates itself in different ways.
Yeah, she's very aware, isn't she, that like Claire said at the beginning of the book, that her ability to do these things are based on almost like a taken for granted. She can space the children out, she can have these things, and then look what women can do. And it was going to those countries then and making those practical changes and showing them practically how, by doing that, by making women's lives better, you make everybody's lives better.
I think there was a story towards the beginning about, it might have been the one, I can't remember now. Was it something to do with? Was it something to do with a bicycle? Oh, I don't know. I think I'm getting them all mixed up.
You're on about that lady where they got the man to bicycle to the water.
Oh yes, yes.
Maybe. I thought there was something else towards the beginning of the story. I can't quite remember what it was. Or it might have been yours, Michelle, the one that you mentioned about the little girl who wanted a teacher. There was one anyway where she made a pact with I don't know if it was with the elders, that she would undergo the cutting if they would let her go to school and be a teacher. And then she came back and she was one of the few people.
She sounded extraordinary.
She did, yeah. What an awful bargain to have to make.
Yeah, and I think that is what really struck me. Some of those stories where, that extraordinary girl, from what she was doing, she's sitting there, she is working in rubbish, but she knows the way to get out of this is through education, and she promised she made that awful deal, and she said she'd come back. She could have gone and never come back, and who would have blamed her? But she came back and made a huge difference to her community.
Yeah. Anyone else got any other comments they want to make? Yeah, Matilda?
Yeah, I guess what was important, it was a really good book choice for this month. Obviously, that's kind of why we chose it. I guess that was why it was chosen. And I think it's quite an important book that has not aged well. That's not the right thing, but it wasn't written recently. Particularly,
I remember when it was written.
It was still it was a few years ago.
Yeah.
And in terms of the issues that have gone on this month, in terms of women's rights and inequality, it just kind of shows you that regardless of how difficult some of the issues that were discussed, the reality is, things might have progressed. Women are allowed work, they're allowed in management jobs. There are still really serious risks of being a high-powered woman.
There is still work to do. I think that's it, isn't it? And I think this was a very good book in illuminating that, and actually just really showing fundamentally, right from the really gritty stories, why it's important. And why even when we are sitting here like quite comfortable, etc., but making sure that narrative of empowering women, etc., it still goes through, because it really shows how important it is.
As I said at the beginning, it took me back to sometimes in the 80s, and it gave me the opportunity to reflect and think how far we've come in that time since I was in my sort of 20s, I guess. But there's still an awful long way to go, isn't there? Even in this country. So, but I did find it hopeful, because I've seen progress. I don't know what the others of you think. Do you feel that in this country we've made progress over the decades?
I feel
speechless. I think, I know when I was at school, in the 70s, I think it was when we took the 11 plus, we had the 11 plus in those days, and in my class most of the boys passed it and only about 6 of the girls. And I honestly thought that girls must just be more stupid than boys, because otherwise why would so many boys pass and so few girls? And it probably wasn't until several years later it dawned on me that there were actually 2 schools for the boys to feed into. I came from Newark, so there was the high school where I was, and the Magnus, which was the boys' grammar school, but there was also the Minster in Southall, which didn't take girls in those days. So that's why. Yeah. And it just sort of reminds me of how easily it is to just get the wrong end of the stick, like I did. And
but the
anyway,
pass rate was
now. Sorry,
the pass rate was different for boys as well. It was lower than it was for girls. And it was designed that way, so because girls, because their brain matures in a different way at that stage, so they had a different pass rate. So it wasn't just that.
See, there's something else I've learned. I didn't know that.
But I think you're right.
I just expect things should be fair, and they're actually not, are they?
They need to be scrutinised, regularly scrutinised. So so this book, I think, teaches us that lesson as well.
Yeah,
We've got to keep looking back and looking lower and seeing what's really going on.
There was one sentence towards the end of the book, which I think is quite a nice one to finish on. I can't quote it word for word, but I'd written outrage, and it's very easy to feel outraged about some of the things that happen to women all over the world. So outrage will change the things for a couple of people, but empathy will change it for the whole community. And I thought that was a nice phrase. I liked that.
Yes.
Anyone got any parting thoughts?
I'd recommend people read it. That would be my
I definitely would.
Yes,
really worth grappling with.
Yeah,
lovely. So I think that scored a hit then. Yeah, it's one that I probably wouldn't have read had it not come up as one of the very limited choices we have for the book club. But yeah, I'm glad that I read it. And thank you all very much for taking part. And we'll see you again next month to talk about something completely different. Okay, bye for now.
Bye.
Bye.